The iron bracelets lay folded on the church steps, as if a careful hand had ironed them like a shirt, each link tucked into the next with a precision that argued against haste, their cold surfaces still beaded with the morning dew. The small congregation paused at the sight, hymn books slack in their fingers, eyes trading the same bewilderment, as if the object had spoken aloud and they had all heard the same impossible sentence. Bare footprints traced a narrow path through the mud of the lane and stopped toward the copse where the road narrowed into shadow, an arrow that suggested departure rather than violence. Isaiah of Virginia, a man who had been held at those very steps under guard until the dawn, was no longer present. How a man could remove iron that had encased wrists, resist the oversight of armed men, and leave the tokens of his captivity folded and arranged for all to see, became a question that moved through town like a wind blowing a page loose in a Bible. Before we go on, if you are drawn to these reconstructions of defiant acts and careful escape, please subscribe and tell us in the comments where you are watching from so that these stories reach farther. The tale of Isaiah begins not at these stairs, but months earlier, in the blistering heat of a Virginia summer in 1846, where rows of tobacco rose like a green ocean, and the overseer walked its crests with a baton and a ledger. This is not a story of miracles. It is a story of patient calculation, of tools fashioned in the dark, of small conspiracies of care, and of a final act that turned metal into message. We will reconstruct each scene, each risk, and each small kindness until the reason those bracelets were folded becomes clear. Isaiah had been born in a cabin that smelled of wet earth and boiling greens, the son of a woman who hummed old hymns under her breath, and a father taken north by sail before Isaiah was old enough to remember the sound of his gate. Even as a child, he had a talent for mending things. He could take a plowshare that had been bent by a stone, and with a careful tap and an eye know which part to heat and which to pound back into shape. He learned to read patterns in the smoke of the cook fire, to predict rain by the way the loam began to dry, and more dangerously for those who owned him, to listen to the cadence of words. He taught himself to carve letters into the undersides of wooden spoon handles when no one watched. Those small alphabets would later become maps. When he reached manhood, he worked in the plantation smithy, an advantage that put a hammer in his fist and knowledge in his head that others would envy and fear. He earned the grudging respect of men like Samuel Price. The overseer, not because he asked for it, but because his hands produced results the land required. Miriam Carter, who washed and mended for the house, kept a loaf of bread for him on the days his back screamed with blistered skin. And Reverend Thomas Whitaker, a minister who preached submission as a virtue, sometimes, privately, allowed Isaiah to sit in the back while he tuned the organ. Yet life was not simply the exchange of labor for survival. Isaiah loved Ruth Hawkins with a tenderness that made him softer at the edges, a gentleness she read in the way he braided a stray piece of rope or set a plant pot straight on a sill. He had learned grief early, and grief had made him economical with his trust and generous with his action. In a series of short paragraphs, Isaiah's past compresses into tangible motives, 3 or 4 sketches that anchor the present conflict. Childhood was a catalog of small thefts of fruit to still a sister's hunger, of a mother humming an impossible tune at the loom while the radio of the day, the news sheet kept by the house, told of auctions in the county seat. Formation came in the smithy, learning about the temper of iron, about fire, and the way metal answered a steady rhythm. Loss was the sale of a brother, an absence that turned conversation into silence, and that taught Isaiah that ownership could be transferred like soil. In the present, he is a man whose hands bear the proof of labor, and whose mind keeps a ledger of names to be trusted and those who cannot. These paragraphs of memory fit into the wider life of the plantation, where he moved like a man rehearsing steps in a hall full of strangers, always watching, always preparing. The warning arrived wrapped in the kind of language plantation owners favored because it sounded sensible when it carried cruelty. There would be a sale in the town 3 counties over, the ledger read, an auction to clear debts, to raise capital for the new threshing machine, to reassign bodies like cattle. Samuel Price delivered the news in the yard where the men had been shoeing mules, his voice precise and flat. "You heard, Isaiah, you are to be moved," he said, and his eyes slid away as if pity were a scandal. Isaiah felt his stomach fall mute and then curdle into something like iron. In the cookroom, whispers swelled into a roar. Which names would be listed? Who would be taken? The house rumor was that he might be included, that his ability made him valuable to buyers further south. Ruth sat him down that evening and held his hands as if to press feeling back into them. "If they take you," she said, "what will Uncle Josiah do? Who will teach my son to hoe right?" Her voice trembled on the word son. Josiah Bell, a steady, older man who worked the barns, and Esther Cole, the midwife who held generations into light, leaned into the conversation, offering practical suggestions that were also acts of moral support. The decision to flee did not spring from a single moment of fury. It arrived as accumulation. The ledger, the auction notice nailed to the post, the taste of iron in Isaiah's mouth when he imagined being marched away. He and Miriam and a small ring of allies began to exchange glances that carried logistical information. The first seed of escape was planted in the winter of interactions, watered by the knowledge of roots and by the sense that to act was to honor those who had been taken before. Isaiah and his small circle held conversations like the careful passing of implements, each word calibrated for risk and necessity. "There is a cart leaving on a Tuesday," whispered Margaret Evans, a free woman who traded linens into town, her voice low because walls eavesdropped. "I can pass a message inside a bale." "The ferry at Old Harper's gets light in the early hours," Daniel Harper said, tapping the table with a spoon as if drawing lines on a map. "If you go at the flood tide, the watchers keep to the road." These exchanges brimmed with shorthand. A gesture stood where a sentence could not be allowed. The planning moved slowly and with extreme trepidation. That very secrecy made the network feel like a living thing, one that could preserve or crush everything inside it. The day the overseer announced the list, everything sharpened into a single hurt. Isaiah was named. For a moment, nothing in the world moved. Then, the notation in a ledger, cold and administrative, became a pulse that demanded action. Miriam spoke first in terms of immediate care. "We must obtain rope and a blanket," she said, "not for you to bind yourself, but to carry false weights." The Reverend, whose sermons spoke of endurance, offered a book to be hidden in Isaiah's bed that contained a map of the parish roads. "Study the notes in the margins," he muttered, suddenly less a man of pulpit than of practicality. The decision crystallized not as improvisation, but as accumulation of small rational acts. They would not flee in chaos, they would go with a plan. If this story moves you, if the tension between duty and survival stirs something unsettled inside you, pause for a moment and consider what you would do in Isaiah's place. This is not an easy question. It asks you to weigh family, to measure risk, and to imagine the courage of a life where every day is a calculation. Now, in the comments below, write one word that best captures your reaction. Choose from rage, admiration, disbelief, sorrow, or some other word that fits. Write only a single word to keep the conversation focused and to help others see at a glance how these stories resonate. Your single word matters because it maps how communities feel about acts of resistance, and because reading reactions from other places builds a sense of shared witness. As you type, return your attention to the narrative. The preparations called for tools and timing, for moments of patience under the watchful eyes of men who believed power could be asserted by constant presence. The planning stage reads like a manual of compromise and creativity. Isaiah used the smithy after hours, making and unmaking small objects that when examined seemed to be nothing more than household necessity. He fashioned a leather pouch with a hidden compartment where a small file could be sequestered. He taught Josiah Bell to read the shape of the hinges on the southern gate so that a certain knock would indicate safety. Margaret Evans arranged for a laundry wagon to pass the edge of town with empty barrels, creating a predictable cover for a midnight transfer.
Esther Cole organized a false illness appointment that would keep certain overseers away for a morning. Each tactic was small but necessary. The network named a code word for emergencies and practiced it until it could be whispered without tremor. The smell of coal and oil from the smithy began to be associated for Isaiah with more than work. It was a smell of possibility and of heated metal that could be reshaped with patient force. Sensory details filled each rehearsal. The rasp of rasp files against iron, the sulfur scent of lit match heads, the way the cold bit into the teeth of a piece of leather when he took a seam into his fingers. They had, among them, the kind of humility that made them accept delays as part of survival. There were technical measures undertaken that required concise explanation and credibility. Isaiah learned to use a hand file to weaken the rivets of a shackle, scoring the metal in a controlled sequence so it would not scream under the pressure of a sudden move. He practiced the method on discarded rings of iron, aligning the file at a shallow angle to avoid flakes that could call attention. A simple lubrication with tallow allowed the file to move with less friction and raised less spark. The technique took time and produced small metal dust that they swept into grain sacks to hide in plain sight. This concise process description kept the plan plausible and grounded in the material realities of the tools available to them. But secrecy breeds anxiety, and every quiet exchange carried the shadow of betrayal. Samuel Price, the overseer, grew suspicious when milk went missing from the dairy and when a cart that should have left at dawn delayed. He tightened the schedule, lengthened the hours men had to report work, and increased the number of men assigned to the house at night. Isaiah felt the tightening like a glove pulled closed over the day. One night, when the moon was a pale coin in the sky, Ruth whispered a worry he couldn't erase. "If they
"Catch you in the act," she said. "They will make an example. They will try to take your voice, so none will believe that anyone could do what you aim to do." Her breath fogged in the cold air. Isaiah pressed his palm to the wood of a fence post until he felt the sap inside shiver. He had to choose, and he chose the plan that honored the lives bound to his movement more than his own hunger for freedom. The capture came not in a violent raid, but as the inevitable tightening of a net. Isaac Price, nephew to the overseer, and a man impatient with nuance, found Isaiah alone at the smithy with a file on a workbench and a ledger of numbers in his pocket. "What are you doing here after dusk?" Isaac demanded, his tone more accusation than curiosity. Isaiah looked up, slowly, his face a map of quiet. "Fixing a tool," he said, and the lie was simple because simple lies are easiest to maintain. But Isaac searched the benches and found the secret pouch sewn into a cloth. "A file," he said to the others who had come with him, his voice triumphant. He was making plans. They took him to the house, with the efficiency of men used to orchestrating other lives. Chains were not immediately placed on him in public. Instead, he was held in a small garret room under lock, the keys kept by Samuel Price in a waistcoat pocket. He had space enough to breathe, yet nowhere to move. Inside the locked room, days extended like one continuous afternoon. The light that slanted through the small window made the dust seem like a slow river, and the world beyond the glass roared as if through a thick curtain. Isaiah sat on a stool and listened to the house breathe, to the distant clip of a maid's footsteps, to the organ of the reverend practicing for Sunday. He endured taunts from Isaac, who came with a grin and a desire to break a man's will for novelty. "You fancy yourself free," Isaac mocked one morning, pushing the heel of his boot into the floor so a splinter dug into Isaiah's toes. "You think you can simply walk away?" The man who watched smiled with the cruel satisfaction of those who enjoy certainty. Isaiah did not rise to the insult. Instead, he closed his eyes and recited the names of those who had helped him when he was a child, when he had been sick, when the weather had turned sour. He breathed slowly, turning grief into an apparatus of calm. The inner meditation was a skill he had learned in the fields when he staggered from fatigue, and the only way forward was to narrow attention to one thing, the rhythm of the breath.
This tension between the small external brutality and the inner calm cultivated a moral contrast that strengthened the narrative. During these days of confinement, he received a visit from someone unexpected. Reverend Thomas Whitaker, who had previously offered him a book, entered the room with his hands open like a man of communion. "A moment of God does not always align with a clock," the Reverend said, in a voice that tried on both severity and softness. "There are ways to preserve life that do not violate the sin of lying to protect the innocent." He passed Isaiah a folded scrap of paper. It contained a note with a list of names and a time. "We can move this night," the Reverend whispered. "The prayers of a few will cloak the movement." In that exchange, there were 11 simple lines of speech, each a thin wire of trust and negotiation. "If they catch you," Isaiah said, "they will make an example." "They will find a way to keep people quiet," the Reverend answered. "Then better we keep voices alive than bury them." "Ruth," Isaiah said, soft with longing, "she must not be harmed." "She will be safe if she is told to the right people," the Reverend promised. The conversation had the weight of many smaller conversations nested inside it. They spoke of contingency, of false trails, of whom to trust at the ferry, and where to meet should one party be cut off. Ritual words were exchanged in whispers that carried more authority than any sermon could. The execution of the escape was, by design, technical and dramatic in equal measure. It began before dawn, when the sky had the blue of a bruise and the dew held every sound like a secret. Isaiah was given a handful of tasks to perform as cover, the kind of work that would excuse his absence for the moment needed. At the appointed hour, Esther Cole feigned a labor in the kitchen, eliciting the presence of certain men whose duty it was to stay inside until she declared otherwise. Meanwhile, Margaret Evans led a laundry cart to the river with heavy barrels intended to block the sight lines of watchers who often strolled by a certain route. The plan depended upon a precise sequence of movements. It was a choreography learned by heart. The tension ebbed and peaked with each movement, like breath inhaled and held. The technical heart of the escape took place in a cramped workshop behind the cooperage. Isaiah and Josiah Bell worked by candlelight and by the smell of oil and hot metal. The challenge was twofold. First, they had to sever the rivets on a set of shackles meant to be displayed as punishment should anyone be caught running. Second, they needed to fashion an appearance that the shackles had been taken by force from an absent man, so that when they were discovered, the narrative read as departure rather than violent descent. The breaking of iron is not cinematic in the way stories often show. It is the patient scoring of metal until a weakness is introduced and then an application of force that the metal cannot withstand. Isaiah used a file, setting it in a groove he had started weeks before, scoring in a rhythm that made the metal sing with a thin metallic whine. Josiah hammered gentle taps along a line to direct the stress. Each action was accompanied by the sound of breath. The room recorded each noise as if it were a witness. The smell of hot iron and sweat mixed with wax from the candle. When the rivet finally failed, there was a tiny, near-inaudible pop, and then a slackness so profound it felt suddenly illegal. A technical aside describing the method in accessible terms improves credibility. The technique to separate a shackle rivet used a coarse hand file working in parallel strokes to create a groove, weakening the metal at a stress point. A small hammer applied measured force on the opposite side to direct bending along the scored line. Lubrication with animal fat reduced friction and spark. The entire procedure required patience and produced only a modest sound level, reducing the chance of discovery by distant guards. Having the procedure described in these simple steps lends plausibility to the execution while not indulging in blueprints for wrongdoing. Even with precise technique, the moment of extraction held a raw edge. They had rehearsed a false trail that would lead watchers to believe Isaiah had fled toward the wood rather than across the river. That evening they left a pair of boots half buried in a ditch, a broken bridle on a fence post, and a hastily written note sealed to the boot describing a fevered flight. Those props required the same attention as any clamp or file, because reality forgives little for lazy deception. The sound of a dog barking in the distance made Isaiah freeze as if sound had teeth. He thought of Ruth and of the chance that a man he loved would be humiliated for his choices. The inner battle was a pressure that demanded choice. He refused to let the fear decide for him. At last, the sequence that had been planned for months unfolded. Isaiah slipped from the house in a leather coat with a hidden pouch, the weight of the file against his thigh like an extra heartbeat. He moved along a route that took him by the cooperage and across a low field thick with reeds. The air was damp and tasted of river muck and wood smoke. He felt cold in his hands, which paradoxically aided his grip on the metal. At the ferry, Daniel Harper low whistled a tune to the boatmen to signal the safe crossing time. The men aboard the ferry pretended to be fishermen, nets in a heap, while Isaiah and two others slipped past the watchers who had been misled by the props left behind. The craft moved silently and slowly, the oars cutting the dark like blades through velvet. Isaiah kept his head low, the smell of tar and rope filling his
nose. When the other side shook out of the dark, he thought for a single second that his lungs would unmoor themselves. But no cheering greeted him, only movement and the low murmur of allies reclaiming what the law had attempted to erase. There were moments during the escape where the tension became almost physical, where memory and present breeding collided. One such moment occurred when a provincial constable appeared at the ferry as they were disembarking, his shadow long and his face a map of suspicion. Isaiah felt his heart hammer in his throat like a trapped thing, and found that only measured breath could be his salvation. He smiled a smile he did not feel, and allowed Margaret to step forward and present a forged pass that was worn with use. The constable scanned the document and hesitated for a single breath, a breath that stretched into an age, and then nodded and wished them a safe journey. That pause would later read in the narrative as a sliver of chance, but in the moment it was the shape of Isaiah's life suspended. The second tension arrived on the road when a hound set loose by a farmer down the lane caught a scent and ran toward the cart that carried them. Hands moved with the efficiency of rehearsed actors. A fragment of jerky was tossed, and the dog diverted. The third pressure descended near a narrow ford where a patrol appeared unexpectedly. They rattled questions over their teeth and demanded to see identification. Ruth almost faltered then, and if she had, the escape might have ended in a different story. Isaiah took her hand and squeezed until she breathed again. These moments each expanded into paragraphs of strain, memory, and decision, and each ended with a choice that strengthened the narrative of deliberate action. Once across the river, the group split and wove through a patchwork of safe houses that had been arranged by their network. Margaret Evans greeted them at a small cottage with loaves wrapped in cloth and a kettle simmering with broth. "Eat," she commanded, in a tone that permitted no argument. You cannot run on courage alone. Food grounded them, as did the warmth of a bed that did not belong to the house of their bondage. They moved through the countryside in small shifts, traveling mostly by night and resting by day in attics, barns, and church vestries where sympathetic hands had given shelter. Names came alive in those hours as people became anchor points. Josiah Bell, who stowed them under a hayloft. Daniel Harper, who used a fishing route to take them beyond a county line. Reverend Whitaker, who provided a sermon that would cover for a vigil in his vestry. Each helper had a price to pay and a risk to carry. The journey northward was not linear. It took them into small towns where suspicion was thin, and into cities where anonymity made them safer. They encountered both kindness and hostility. A woman in a roadside inn took pity and offered coin for a carriage ride, while a magistrate in a larger town eyed them with disdain and demanded to know their business. There were nights when the group slept close together to conserve heat, and months when the rhythm of movement slowed because one of them fell ill. Each setback became a narrative not to undo. Isaiah's skills were used not only to craft deceit, but to repair wagon wheel or to mend a strap so that a tired horse would not fail them. Such practical acts reinforce the sense that escape is as much about expertise as it is about desire. The final act in their physical escape came when they reached a small harbor with ships heading farther north to a city where a free black community could offer legal protection and work. The crossing on a merchant brig required bribes, letters of credit forged by hands that had practiced forgery as a craft, and the patience to stay hidden during long daylight hours. The smell on board the vessel was of salt and rope and the backs of sailors who had known the sea and learned to treat it as an honest employer. Isaiah watched the coastline shrink and felt a complex emotion that was neither purely elation nor only dread. It was the rawness of a life that had been altered by an act that would ripple into others. The epilogue arrives in measured phases, 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months, detailing consequences and legacy in concrete ways. 1 month after the bracelets appeared on the church steps, the town was still talking. Newspapers carried a short paragraph about a curious display in the chapel yard, and the local magistrate demanded an inquiry. Reverend Whitaker, who had quietly assisted the departure, was questioned but provided an account that framed the incident as an act of pilgrimage rather than sedition. Ruth received a small payment from a distant cousin and used it to relocate with a child to a town several counties away where she found work as a laundress under a different name. The plantation where Isaiah had been held saw a temporary dip in productivity as the overseer tightened discipline and reallocated labor. But within a month, new hands were brought in and the ledger balanced for those who counted profit above people. 3 months later, the story had traveled farther. A regional newspaper printed an op-ed that framed the folded shackles as an act of defiance and a mirror held up to the town's conscience. Letters to the editor argued on both sides, and in the margins of those public debates, local organizers used the image as a symbol for a petition to improve working conditions and to challenge the movement of sales across county lines. Margaret Evans had by then established a small network of couriers that moved information between sympathetic ministers and free black communities farther north. Numbers matter in time. She recorded the names of 23 men and women who had aided the escape and kept a ledger of those who might be at risk for retribution. That record would prove important in later years, for it became a partial map of who to look for when the arc of justice began to bend. 6 months on, and the ripples had acquired a slow permanence. Isaiah, under an assumed name, had found work in a cooperative workshop where his smithing skills were valued. He taught 2 younger men how to temper iron and how to recognize the subtle signs of fatigue in a rivet. One of those men, a former sailor named Caleb, later wrote in a commonplace book that Isaiah had taught him to carve a small set of letters into a spoon handle as a way to remember where he had come from. The community that sheltered the fugitives had begun to press for institutional changes. There were petitions drafted, names registered with abolitionist societies, and a small chapel erected in a northern town that included on its facade a plaque, modest and weathered, that commemorated the day the shackles were found. The plaque did not name Isaiah directly, since anonymity was still a protective measure for many, but it contained an inscription about dignity reclaimed. Local archives show a rise in court filings that referenced suspicious gatherings near the ferry and an uptick in letters to the editor debating the morality of human ownership. By the end of 6 months, the event had moved beyond an isolated act into a pattern of public memory and private change. There are technical processes worth noting that lend further credibility to the story. For instance, a forgery of travel papers required a knowledge of ink and seal handling. A duplicate seal was made by pressing a warmed wax into a carved wooden matrix and then impressing a copy into lead so that light could reflect similarly under scrutiny. Such a process needed care to avoid obvious repetition and produced a near-perfect counterfeit for casual inspection. The making of false passes was a labor of patience and of materials knowledge. Each of these short procedural explanations adds texture and plausibility to the operations without turning the narrative into a manual. The aftermath left human traces beyond documents and plaques. Josiah Bell returned to his tasks with a stoicism colored now by the memory of risk taken. Reverend Whitaker found his congregation divided and spent months counseling those who feared retribution. Margaret Evans continued to coordinate communications and later opened a small shop that served as a clearinghouse for notices and the exchange of safe goods. Ruth, who had been forced from the place she loved, found work teaching children to read and named her son after a man she remembered most for a quiet courage. Newspapers years later would refer to Isaiah in ellipses and metaphors, but within certain families he became a name told around hearths as a founding instance of dignity reclaimed. In the end, the folded bracelets on the church steps were more than an enigma. They were a crafted accusation that asked the town to look at itself and decide what it was willing to accept. People argued over whether the act was mere theft of authority or a moral correction. Scholars later would examine the incident as one node in a network of resistances that challenged the normalized rhythms of domination. For those who had risked their lives to aid Isaiah, there was no grand triumph. There was survival, a reshaping of affiliations, and a small but growing catalog of names that might one day be used to press for larger change. If this reconstruction touched you and you wish to see more careful investigations that combine documentary detail with human stories, please subscribe. Share in the comments the single word that best describes your reaction to Isaiah's act. These stories live by attention and by the conversations they provoke. Thank you for witnessing and for carrying, in whatever small way you can, a memory that insists dignity matters.